Hi, and welcome to another episode of Forward Thinking. This time, a book club conversation with author David Brin. And this particular episode is made possible by our partners at CGI, who are helping us to produce some of these book clubs where we have conversations with authors about fascinating topics that affect the public service, government, politics, and society in general. My guest today, David Brin, is a famous author of some of my favorite science fiction books, but he's also done a lot of work thinking about the future. He's written some nonfiction books, including the one we're going to be discussing, The Transparent Society, another one called Visible Tomorrows. And we have a ton of things to discuss here because his book, while written in the late 90s, is prescient. And it outlines a future in which everything is surveilled and asks that if that future is inevitable, then maybe we should learn to accept that everything will be recorded and everything will be visible and privacy will be diminished, and decide how we want to live in that world. Now, the book was written a while ago, so it has some endearing gaps between the current and the future state, but the underlying lessons are rooted in hard science, and the book is based on an article that first appeared in Wired magazine. So I've invited David here to give us a preview of the book, and maybe people that haven't had a chance to consume the whole thing will be able to use this as Cliff's Notes for further discussions. So please join me in giving a very warm, forward-thinking welcome to David Brin. Hi, David.
Hello, Alistair, and hello in the background to the controller of events, your sister Rebecca.
Nothing good happens without Rebecca's involvement.
Yeah. And a hello to all the very serious thought leaders in industry who are taking part in this important book club.
So, David, I love the book, or I love the book. I'm not all the way through it yet, but I plan to be. And it is fascinating how many things you got right, and then how many things we missed because they sort of were a sea change. And I'm reminded of, as we shall see, the sort of Vannevar Bush stuff. There are some predictions that are incredibly prescient, but it's impossible to get them all right. I think the biggest one is the smartphone. The fact that many of these cameras were things like CCTV in the UK we thought would be everywhere, but in fact, most of them we're carrying around with us. And so we have a strange editorial control of what we choose to record and how we edit it and how we frame it. That's not necessarily like the unvarnished truth coming from the feed, but a contextualized truth that we have chosen by what we choose to shoot and how we then edit it. Regardless of those differences, the book really tackles some very hard questions. And the thing I think I love the most about it is that it's not about whether or not this technology will happen. The horse has left the barn, Pandora's box is open. It's about accepting that privacy is never going to be the same, and then asking what kind of society we want as a result of that. So that's the part that I really appreciated about the book, is you're confronting truths that many people feel like we can still sweep under the rug, and then asking, what should we do about it, instead of wringing our hands about how to sweep it under the rug for a while. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what was the thing that triggered you to write the Wired article that then eventually became this book, and why that was so obvious to you at the time.
Well, first off, you raised a bunch of great things, and science fiction, serious science fiction, which is, of course, a small fraction of it. It usually falls into three time domains. One is near future projections. What if something were to happen that would perturb the society we're living in right now? Then there's the far future projections, which you get in space opera. You can see one above my head. This is the cover of my first novel, Sundiver. It's a murder mystery in which the victim is dumped into the sun, so it's a little hard to do CSI. In between is the 30 to 50 year projection, in which you have to bear in mind, as you say, half of the reader's reactions in 30 to 50 years when they look back at the book will be, oh man, you underestimated, and the other being overestimation of the degree of change. Now, cell phones were actually obvious to a few science fiction authors like Frederick Pohl, and I could provide you for later for the group for one of the only novels that predicted what we're carrying in our pocket. But of course, now it's very clear that the cell phone, that slab of inconvenient, heavy glass, is going to go away. It's going to be embedded in the corner of sunglasses, the corner of our eyeglasses, perhaps inside our eyes, though a lot of people will resist that. And we're going to head towards augmented reality. Well, I portray that in one of my recent novels called Existence. And I'll provide in chat a link to the 3-minute video trailer to that novel. The point is that the specifics are less important than the social changes. I specifically, for instance, many years ago predicted that 2022 or 2023 would be about the right place for the arrival of the flying car at last. And I'm still on target for that. I'm still taking wagers on that because I think by the end of 2023, the uber wealthy will be using the equivalent of flying cars. And then the question will be sociologically be, is this going to be one of those cases like the telephone, television, radio, and things like that, freely available water, that will percolate quickly to the masses? Or will it be a case like the airplane where it did those things, but now the rich are leaving us, they're leaving first class and going to private jets, which is creating more social enemy than they perhaps realize. So the social effects of change are what science fiction is really about. It was once said by Isaac Asimov that his job is not to predict the automobile, but to predict the traffic jam. So the fact that there is, some people flatteringly call it Brin's corollary to Moore's law, and that is that the cameras every year get faster, better, cheaper, vastly more numerous, more mobile, at a rate much faster than Moore's law. And as an aside, I've written about how this makes it really hard on the folks who fetishize on UFOs, because there are about 1 million times as many active cameras today on Earth as there were in the 1950s when the images of UFOs were much more clear. In other words, they've been getting fuzzier and fuzzier apace with the spread of cameras. And that's a completely separate matter. I may refer your listeners to an essay about that. But the main thing is that we're riding a tsunami of technologically driven change. And the question is, shall we stand athwart history, as William F. Buckley said? Stand athwart history with our hands up saying, stop. Like King Canute telling the waves not to come in, the tide not to come in. Or shall we learn to surf? Now, I liked the way you expressed it. You said our ideas of privacy are going to change. Many people have a glance at the cover flap of the Transparent Society and say that I'm against privacy. Matter of fact, I really love privacy. And the only way we're going to get privacy in the future is the way we got it in the first place, because privacy is a recent modern invention. Our ancestors who lived in pyramids of feudalism didn't have much or any. Those who lived in communist regimes, the local commissar would know everything about your life. The local gossip in the old villages. We have more privacy today, largely because we've created a civilization that does two things. One, it empowers us to see and catch most of those who would violate our privacy. And second is just as important. There's a social norm of what's called MYOB, mind your own business. If you catch somebody who's violating your privacy, the cultural norm is that's wrong. And so if you catch them, and that's technological, you can denounce them. And that is the only way that we ever got privacy. And it's the only way we ever will. And that is by reciprocal accountability. And it can be aimed upward. We're the only civilization that ever aimed accountability upward as well at elites. So that's some of what I was talking about in the Transparent Society. I don't expect everybody to agree, but the whole idea is that we live in a civilization that benefits from reciprocal argument and criticism. And when we have shadows that prevent criticism from flowing, you almost inevitably make major errors. And that is exactly the world that many of the authoritarian regimes around the world want to reinstitute after 6,000 years of really, really rancid feudalism.
So I have lots more questions. I hope that's okay. The first is, humans, we have this sense that, like, if you're staring at someone in a restaurant and they catch your eye, you feel bad. You feel a sense of sort of shame, and I shouldn't have been staring or whatever. It's rude to stare. Algorithms don't know it's rude to stare. Algorithms are very good at staring. In fact, you could argue that some algorithms, that's all they do is stare. I was in Japan in 2012 with a friend of mine, and he took my photo and I uploaded it to Facebook. And then Facebook did that thing where it was tagging people in the picture. And there was some guy in the background who just happened to be walking by. And it was like, who's this? I have no idea. And I would never think he was, to me, just the background of the image. But of course, Facebook went, I see a face. Who is that? And it's very easy to see a world where if that person were a criminal and the government had access to that information, that they would go and look for that person and be able to pinpoint the person's movements without their consent. On the other side, people would say, well, photons are free. He was out in public. So if algorithms don't mind when we catch them staring, because they have no sense of, like, algorithms don't care about denouncement. How do we denounce an algorithm? How do we get recourse over the behaviors of an algorithm in a public space?
Well, you're raising several points. And one is the great science fiction novelist and my neighbor and pal, Vernor Vinge. He's the guy who coined the now pretty widely known term, the singularity. For what
wait, you live next to Vernor Vinge?
Well, not next to, but I had him on the phone yesterday. Unfortunately,
he's in San Diego. Yeah, I mean, the amazing clash of different metaverses is one of my favorite scenes ever. Wow.
You know, he's having health problems, so I help look after him. But he coined the term singularity as it concerns not physics, but the notion that there might be a time in the very near future when the rate of progress, especially in artificial intelligence, accelerates so quickly that essentially it's like a mathematical singularity. It's impossible to predict what will be after that. And so I just finished a major essay about artificial intelligence, the 6 different approaches to developing artificial intelligence, and the central aspect that finding ways to find a soft landing for bioorganic humanity is of great importance. And there are people who say, well, we should institute Asimov's laws of robotics. Now, it happens that I wrote the last Asimov Foundation novel. It's called Foundation's Triumph. And I really believe I tied together all of Isaac's loose ends very, very carefully. But in fact, the laws of robotics won't work. Even if they would have worked, no institution, no nation, there's no economic drive to spend the kind of money that it would take to embed such laws into the algorithms and the robots. We're going to have to do that with the Boston Dynamics and the fighting robots and all that sort of thing, but it's going to be tough. It's going to be hard.
Yeah, I had a conversation with someone at the White House or near the White House a few years back, asking about explainable AI and all this kind of stuff. And he said to me, well, we looked at this from a game theory point of view, and we found that there's no way in which the Nash equilibrium becomes every nation state agrees to make its AI explainable, because the AI that is explainable will underperform those that aren't. And therefore, the country that breaks those rules gets an unfair advantage in an arms race.
Well, especially
that's really disappointing. And he said, yeah, we did this modeling with the Rand Corporation like 8 years ago. So that's a disturbingly well understood, like, just throw your hands up and say, never mind.
Especially if you have a world in which there are nation states which, unlike mafias, and many other oligarchies, they try to avoid accountability. They try to avoid light. But certain authoritarian nation states are able to do it. They can shut down and kill our spies. They can have secret labs in all sorts of hidden mountain places. And this lack of transparency is potentially lethal to humanity. It's an existential threat. And it is the biggest reason, beyond just being appalled that they are oppressing their own people. But the biggest reason to be concerned about lack of world transparency is because it's an existential threat to us all. And the reason is because when you do something in secret, guess what? All humans are delusional. All of us. We're all delusional. We think our plans are perfect, and we think that we've got things sussed out just right. And we're almost always wrong. But this was a horrible thing back when you had monarchies or autarkies in which the top leaders' delusions went unquestioned. Our enlightenment, the last 250 years, has been progressively to apply accountability upward and laterally. And we do this through 5 basic arenas. The arena of courts, law courts, that applies accountability in a meticulous way. Markets apply accountability on products, goods, and services through competition. Democracy applies accountability through competition and policy, when democracy used to work. And maybe it will again. Then there is science, which still does work through reciprocal competition. Scientists are the most competitive.
Well, it does seem to me like this is even more fundamental, that natural selection is this tension between the randomness and mutation and expression of certain genes that causes divergence, but then the regression towards the norm of convergence. So there's enough of the species to breed past any mutation. And if you have too much regression towards the norm, you get stagnation. If you have too much mutation, you get extinction. And so there's this sort of tension of all systems, right? I was thinking
about that just yesterday. The fact is that in nature, there is no Lion King. What seems natural human tendency to make pyramids of power, and jot me a note, and I'll get you a link to where I decrypted the standard incantation of the court intellectuals in Beijing. And that standard incantation is: the only way we can deal with AI, with technological obsolescence, and all these other things, is by a benevolent party pyramid of power. And they think we're crazy, and they might be right, but there is another approach, and that is the approach of nature. There is no Lion King. It turns out that when the lion populations get too large, gangs of young male Cape buffalo go hunting lions. They stomp them to death, they gore them with their horns, and they find the cubs hidden in the hidden dens, and they trample them. We just recently saw examples of humpback whales fighting orcas, not to save a humpback calf, but to save a seal. So these lateral accountability competition systems are what works in nature. They're what works in our society. I mentioned markets, democracy, science, justice courts. And the last one is the one that really proves the case, and that is sports. All five gain the benefit of competition, but you never get, as Adam Smith said, you never get the benefits of competition if the most powerful can cheat. And that's what 6,000 years of pyramidal feudalism and monarchism and all that were about, was a few guys at the top cheating to prevent others from competing with them.
So let's bring this back to, I don't want to cut you off. I want to make sure we get to we apply that thinking specifically to this idea of privacy and surveillance. What is the tension? What is the healthy tension between ubiquitous surveillance and a desire for, I guess, accountability to those who would surveil, that you think is going to serve us best in a world where we have to accept that we're always being surveilled?
Well, you know, the point is that if you look at George Orwell's 1984, and in Vivid Tomorrows, I talk about how Orwell's 1984 is the archetype of the self-preventing prophecy. It scared tens of millions of people into making Big Brother their central metaphor for what to resist. Other self-preventing prophecies include all the movies that scared us about different ways that nuclear war could start. And retired officers then said that.
That's right. You mentioned Dr. Strangelove actually had an impact on the nuclear
Strangelove, fail-safe, On the Beach, War Games. Contagion helped prepare us for pandemics, and the China syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. So I talk about the self-preventing prophecies. But the thing about Orwell is that he portrayed spectacularly in 1948 the likelihood that there'd be a telescreen that would surveil from above, and it would be very hard for you to do anything that the state missed. The thing about that world is not that this technology exists. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen, but that it's one way. If all the proles in the outer party were able to watch Big Brother and everything he said in the inner party all the time, 24 hours, despite the fact that they have all the guns, it's going to be a very different world. If the mighty are held accountable with light and criticized, A, their delusions will be criticized and less likely to kill us all, but B, they're going to be less likely to oppress us. But here's the thing about transparency. We can eliminate Big Brother if we embrace the cameras and the tools and look back at all elites. But that only takes us to phase 2. Let's say that everybody can see everybody else, and therefore we don't have Big Brother. Everything's democratic. Well, then 51% of the population could legally, openly vote laws that oppress the 49%, or more likely 60-40 or 70-30. That's an extreme danger, and it's pointed out in Black Mirror episode called Nosedive, in which the social credit, your social score, is so desperately important to you that you suck up to your neighbors. And the Beijing regime is deliberately instituting lateral social credit so that people will homogenize each other. The state
and it does seem to me like this idea that we are all in a contest for approval is a sort of side effect of surveillance. So it's not just that we need to have two-way surveillance, but we need to change the social norms. I wrote a post 10 years ago called The Spaghetti Fetish, where if you read the book The Joy of Sex, which came out a while ago, they actually talk about fetishism, and they use the example of somebody who had a certain peccadillo of immersing themselves in a bathtub full of pasta. And that's kind of strange, right? But I think in the modern world, you go online, you're probably going to find, according to Rule 34 of the internet, you're going to find like 10,000 people who have that particular bent. And as primates, we have this Dunbar number where I have 200 to 300 people, some experts vary, who can keep track of the social relationship. So for example, I know that you know Michael, and I can keep track of that relationship. But once we go online and we find over 250 people who are like us, we start to believe we're in this moral majority, and pretty soon we're having, pasta marches in the street. And this idea that we have to balance democracy, the will of the many, with constitution, the rights of the individual, gets skewed by our primate brains, because we can very quickly go and find 10,000 people who agree with us. And that tricks our sort of jungle surplus village wetware into thinking, oh, I'm in the majority, I have certain rights and privileges. That's all going to get changed, right?
Or you're in a minority that is in the know. Those scientists are all a bunch of herd lemmings, but I'm among the 10,000 that actually know the truth. Because
so it seems to me like it's not just about two-way surveillance, but it's also about the veracity of what is being surveilled. I mean, we haven't touched on deep fakes and fakery. If you can watch both ways, but one side gets to control the filters, that's a very different experience as well, right? So it seems like you're scratching the surface of something, but when you unpack it, there's a lot more readjustment of societal norms that needs to happen as well.
Well, absolutely. And you actually asked exactly the right question, because let's say we have this inevitable tsunami of cameras and other tools that are going to look at everything. And let's say we do what I think is the right thing, and that's embrace and surf on this wave of light and use it to ensure that all of those who would plot against us get caught. Now we get to the second level that I described when I talked about the Beijing efforts to grant social credit so that those who stand out get hammered down. And so they won't have to arrest everybody like in 1984, because most of the conformity is being laterally enforced by a homogenizing effect. And that's where that Black Mirror episode portrays it happening in our world. The extreme of that, it was mentioned by Vernor Vinge in one of his novels, universal law enforcement. That means if every time you break a law, you're automatically caught. Well, you can't afford all the speeding tickets you get. But that ignores the fact that speeding tickets are very expensive because most don't get caught. Do you think in a democracy people would put up with $500 speeding tickets 5 times a day? No. What would happen is the law would adjust so that it became more like a toll in the old-fashioned phone calls. And if you were late picking up grandma at the airport, you'd be willing to pay the 25 cents per minute per mile per hour above the speed limit, that you would crank it up. And
well, this reminds me of sort of coin shaving and horse thievery, where they were punishable by an extreme response because they were hard to prosecute with tremendous societal impacts.
Right.
So surveillance makes those kinds of things possible. Now you're seeing insurance companies that will charge you per kilometer driven, but if you brake too hard, then you pay more. It almost feels like we're entering a world where surveillance has consequences for legislation. And now we're getting to, obviously, the government side of things, like how do governments enact policy around this?
But the more important thing is social. And I alluded to this before, and so did you. And that is, if we live in a world in which eccentricity and differences are celebrated, then And we have a basic principle of MIOB, mind your own business. If a voyeur and a oppressor of difference is considered to be a bad person, then transparency catches those in the act. And that is the answer to that terrible movie and book, Dave Eggers' The Circle. You have this scene in which these people are oppressing the shy person with their cameras, recording this horrible person who dares to want privacy. And the camera should have pulled back and seen all the other people who were crowding in saying, look at these bullies. Look at that poor guy being bullied by these guys. I'm going to send this footage of you bullying him to your mother. In the end, that's actually the only thing that's going to make level 2 equilibrate in a way that would work. And as it turns out, as I point out in Vivid Tomorrows, that message is in almost every Hollywood film. There's suspicion of authority messages in almost every Hollywood film. It may be attacking aliens, or it could be a mother-in-law, but there's some authority figure to be resisted. Diversity, tolerance, and eccentricity. And the protagonist's eccentricity in the movie helps you bond with that character, even though it's not your eccentricity. And I think that's very telling. So the social value that is spread by Hollywood, it is in some ways exactly the value that we need in order to prevent the level 2 failure amid all these cameras and all this light. The problem is that right now, this uppity suspicion of authority reflex, especially of Americans, is being used against us. Propaganda is pouring out there, getting about 1/3 of Americans to turn their suspicion of authority reflex and hatred of elites toward people who know stuff. Science, journalism, teaching, medicine, law, and now the so-called deep state, the intelligence officers and the military officers who won the Cold War and the war on terror. How are they your enemies suddenly? So I'm not saying that this is going to be won. I'm saying that we have the tools by which to win. Sorry about that. My wife will pick it up.
That's okay. This is all fascinating, and honestly, I could just talk about this stuff for days. But we both have things to get to. I do want to ask you, from a public policy point of view, one of the things I love about how you think about this, and also your writing, is that you have this rare ability to look at the hard science, but still remember that we're all humans. We're all bags of meat, working on reflexes and norms and seeking the approval of our friends and that kind of stuff. It seems to me like governance and regulation needs to live in the line between those two things, that it needs to be both very based on facts and science and research and data, but also it needs to account for the foibles of humans at scale. I see a lot of people talk about privacy legislation, AI governance, all these kinds of rules. What do you wish public servants and policymakers brought to the table when they were trying to make decisions about regulating technology in general and the privacy rules and identity rules that we're going to have to create to thrive online?
Well, there's all sorts of people all over the world are deeply concerned about this. And I urge people to join the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the ACLU. They're fighting this fight, even though I'm highly critical of some of the details of what they recommend. They can tell that Big Brother would use all of these techniques. And they are scared about that, and they are paladins for freedom, but they often prescribe the wrong thing. And one of the things is we can hold off technology. So this silliness of the San Francisco City Council banning face recognition. I'm sorry, face recognition is already totally distributed. Get used to it. But what you can do is subject face recognition to criticism. And that can only happen when it's in the open. And face recognition systems were rightfully criticized for being racist in their data sets. Fine, that's exactly finding the problem in the open. When I first got started about the Transparent Society, it was back during the Clipper chip stuff. And they were trying to say encryption is, and Snowden still, and he's a mixed bag, but he's no Julian Assange. He actually has some interesting things to say, but encryption is a complete wrong approach because it's not going to work. Every year we find reliable encryption systems that failed, and it's going to keep happening every single year. No, the solution, and the Europeans are especially prone to this, a paternalistic top-down approach to regulating information. Yes, in the short term, there are some such things, palliatives, that are necessary. And we may need to regulate some of the social media sites. But over the long run, the solution is going to be that we trust individuals to protect each other. I spotted the telltale signs that some dirty-minded voyeur flew a NAT camera into your bedroom. Let's follow the emanations back and tell his mom. If neighbors protect each other because they are empowered technologically, then I think we have a chance to navigate this minefield.
Well, I think it's important that we know it's a minefield, and I think it all comes back to sort of education, awareness, transparency, openness. You know, the window has to be two-way, and it has to be unfiltered. And then what we decide to do with what we see, looking through it both ways, is the real question for society. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation with a bunch of executives to talk about this in a couple of weeks. I'm really enjoying the book. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today to kind of frame the issues. Obviously, we have lots more to talk about, so I'm really looking forward to that.
So am I. You framed a bunch of very good questions, Alistair, and I'm looking forward to the community of similarly brilliant folks that you gathered to grill me.
We'll see how that goes, but either way, it's going to be a fascinating conversation, David. Thank you so much.